Greetings. Here we are back again with the politically incorrect old white guy. And as promised, we're going to talk about socialism and in particular the variant of socialism that is practiced in Scandinavia, since proponents of that ideology seem to favor the Scandinavian version over the, let's say, less successful Venezuelan, Zimbabwean, Cuban versions. And so let's begin by talking a little bit about socialism and capitalism. What do those terms really mean? Well, in order to understand those terms, we have to understand what capital is. So human endeavor, human labor, human effort produces simplistically two different varieties of, or two different types of goods or service. There are consumer goods, which are immediately available for consumption, such as shoes, food, beer, cigarettes, and one could also argue consumer durables such as vehicles that are used for transportation, housing that is used for day-to-day living, and washing machines and so forth. Those are goods that are produced for immediate or consumption. Then there's a variety of goods or services, or goods in particular, that are produced not because they have any immediate consumptive benefits, but because they are used to produce goods indirectly that can be consumed. So I mentioned shoes. Well, a sewing machine that's used to sew the soles onto the shoes, onto the uppers, is a capital good, and it only has value. You can't eat it, you can't enjoy it. It has no value other than the fact that it can be used to sew shoe soles onto shoes. That's a capital good. It's an indirect step to producing a consumer good. A railroad is of no benefit in and of itself. You can't eat railroad tracks. You can't exercise on railroad tracks. You could try, I suppose, but railroad tracks are valuable because they are helpful in producing or moving, for example, food from the farm to the market. And thus they are an indirect activity or an indirect route to consumption. Factories, housing that is produced for rental purposes is, or to produce income, is a capital good. Its immediate use is not, the purpose is not immediate consumption, but a means to an end, and so on. So that's what capital is. Capital, another way of looking at capital is a tool. Capital is tools that are used in making our lives better. And in order to produce capital, one has to give up some consumption. One has to save. One has to deny oneself immediate gratification, because you're going to spend some time making a sewing machine and you can't eat the sewing machine. So it requires somebody to make a sacrifice in order for capital to be created. And that somebody is either the person who, it could be a person, or could be someone who you lend money to or invest in to do the work. But either way, somebody somewhere along the line has to deny themselves a nice restaurant meal, have to save that money rather, and either use that money to produce something that is going to help them in the future, or lend that money or invest that money in somebody else who's going to do that. And there's an element of risk in doing so. The sewing machine that you develop might not work at all. You might have messed up the design, or it might work, but not very well. And someone else might come up with a better one, and then you won't be able to sell any of your sewing machines. So there's an element of risk that you might end up denying yourself and losing your savings. And this is what makes capital kind of interesting. Now, the difference between socialism and capitalism is under the capitalist system, the ownership of those tools is private. And the rewards, if indeed there are any rewards, accrue to the person who saved their money and who took a risk. Under a socialist system, a pure socialist system, those capital goods belong to everybody. And by default, that means that some government bureaucrat administers them, maintains them, decides what capital tools, what capital to employ, how many sewing machines to make, what kind of sewing machine, who gets the sewing machine. So you've got a bureaucrat doing all that instead of the person that made the sacrifice and took the risk. Now, that's kind of a theoretical view of socialism and capitalism. In practice, there's no pure capitalism and there's no pure socialism. Every economy, every country is a blend. It exists somewhere in that spectrum, from pure capitalism to pure socialism. They're somewhere in between. There are, in most countries, for example, as I've mentioned previously, a lot of countries, the railroads and the airline belong to the government, and the government makes all those decisions of what planes to buy and how to maintain them, where to fly them from point A and point B, how much to charge for that. The tools, the capital is managed by the government, and it belongs to nobody really, but I guess it belongs to everybody, nobody and everybody, and therein lies part of the problem. In another way of thinking about socialism, a common definition is free stuff. Socialism is free stuff. Capitalism is you've got to work for everything. Unfortunately, there is no free stuff. Sewing machines, locomotives, airplanes do not grow on trees. Somebody has to make a sacrifice in order for those things to exist. And if the government is the owner or the administrator of capital, everybody is making a sacrifice in the sense that they work 24 hours a day and they only get paid for, or 12 hours a day, 8 hours a day, they only get paid for 6. The government takes the other 2 and uses them to or maybe they only leave you with 4, pay you for 4, and they use the balance to create and employ capital. So the definition free stuff should really be other people's stuff. And that's essentially the debate in the United States and many countries around the world. To what extent are people entitled to other people's stuff? You hear, talk about rights. Healthcare is a right. Well, healthcare isn't free. The people that provide healthcare want to get paid. The people that build the X-ray machines and MRI machines and build the hospitals, they need to get paid. And somebody needs to sacrifice in order to create that capital. So there's no free stuff. It's other people's stuff. And to what extent do you want to take from other people to provide to people who don't have the wherewithal to provide for themselves? it's it's not a right. Healthcare is not a right. You don't have a right to other people's stuff. Uh, it might be nice, and other people might decide it's okay because they're, you know, uh, generous, caring people. They might decide that we don't want anyone to suffer in our society, and therefore we'll give up some of our stuff so that other people can have free stuff. That's perfectly legitimate, and that happens in many countries in the world. Not everybody's on board with it, but I guess the majority are because the systems are still in place. Countries that have free healthcare or almost free healthcare include Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and the Scandinavian countries that we're going to talk about in a minute. The United States has limited versions of free healthcare through Medicare. Medicaid is freer than Medicare. Medicare participants pay monthly for their healthcare, and in fact, they pay their entire working lives for their healthcare. They and their employers. So when they get old and their healthcare needs tend to exceed their ability to pay for it themselves, they so-called put that money away theoretically, and if they didn't put very much away, somebody else put money away, and they'll be taken care of. So that's socialism, capitalism, and capital in simple terms. Let's now take a look at this exhibit over here, which is a bit of a diversion. I like to start off these sessions by talking about the fact that government seems to have a knack for failing their citizens. And at the same time, I admit that government is nevertheless necessary. So let's start on the positive side. What you're looking at here is a website called aviationweather.gov. And there are various screens you can pull up. This particular screen is the winds screen. And what's different about this screen, this information versus the common weather forecast, is that you not only see what's going on at the surface, which is this map here, and these little arrows show the wind direction, and the little feathers on the end of them show the strength. Each little hash mark is 10 knots. So these are rather light winds, and these light blue gray colors are indicative of light wind conditions. Here where I'm located, we have about 10 knot winds from the southwest today on the surface. But what's more interesting is when you're flying an aircraft, you don't fly at the surface. You might fly at 6,000 feet. So you go over here at 6,000 feet, and you can see what direction the wind is blowing at and along your route, and you can see how strong the wind is. So that's particularly useful information, because if you're flying, let's say I'm making a trip to the West Coast from where I am now, first off, I see, well, here's some darker blue, and that means the wind is somewhat stronger. It's 20, 25 knots, and it's actually blowing from west to east, and I'm heading west. So I'm going to be flying into the wind, and my ground speed is going to be reduced commensurately. And if I don't plan ahead, I might run out of fuel before I hit the West Coast. So this sort of information is critical, and the government provides it, and this particular function of government works quite well. They give you, all sorts of weather information that's useful to pilots, and it doesn't make sense for there to be multiple sources of this information. You want one definitive source, and the government may as well provide it. So there you have it. Government is necessary. I said it. Having said that, government will fail you, and they seem to fail you rather often. For this session, let's look at two particular failures. The first is the pier, the artificial pier, and this is Reuters, a credible source, the artificial pier that the Biden administration built off Gaza so that they could transport relief aid, food and so on, water, medical supplies to the Gazans while they're getting pounded by the Israelis. I guess they figured incorrectly that the Israelis weren't going to do it. They were busy blowing stuff up. So the United States felt that they should help the civilians by providing food, and the only way to get it in there, or the most likely way to get it in there, was by ship, and for that they needed a pier, which didn't exist, so they built this pier, and they spent $300 and something $300 and something $million building this pier. The military did it, and there were 1,000 people involved in building it, and delivering the goods. There we go, $230 million. I lied. And the good people of Gaza didn't enjoy much benefit from that $230 million expense, which in the scheme of things, the US government is chump change. But if you look at it from this perspective, the average working stiff probably over his or her working lifetime probably pays between $500,000 and $1 million in federal taxes. You know, those higher income people pay $1 million or more. You know, lower income, not poverty level, but let's say middling income people end up paying about $500,000 to the government in their lifetime. So what this represents is about 300 to 500 US citizens, hardworking taxpayers, their entire lifetime contribution to the federal government just got flushed down the toilet. So thank you very much, you 300. I hope you're not one of them. You 300 to 500 people that saved and worked and paid your taxes honestly every year, thinking that you were doing the right thing for the common good. You weren't. You people got. They just took your money and they may as well have burned it, because nothing came of it. Not even the Gazans got anything out of it. And it's somewhat preposterous that you should be paying for the Gazans. You could argue that they brought this mess upon themselves by poking Israel to the point where Israel had to do something. So there's failure number one, typical government failure. Failure number two, on a much larger scale, the Paycheck Protection Program, and this is NPR, which we all know is pro-government. That's who funds them, and they don't want to offend government. But even they talk about this Paycheck Protection Program and how it failed dismally. If you don't know what we're talking about, during COVID, small businesses shut down because everyone had to stay home. So the employees lost their jobs or were staring job loss in the face, and the government came up with this program whereby they said to employers, you know what, we will pay your employees on your behalf, or we will give you the money so you can keep your employees on the payroll. And the only thing you have to do is keep them on the payroll. When business comes back, they continue working, so they don't end up, jobless. And they provided these loans to small businesses, and the total extent of this was in the billions. Now we're talking about real money. Here we go. $800 billion. That's almost $1 trillion of loans were issued. Okay, 800 billion. And that's like the lifetime contribution, tax contribution of, I can't do the math here immediately off the top of my head, but probably, a good 10 or 20% of the taxpayers in the country. Your money just got handed out with gay abandon to anybody and everybody who asked for it. Now, who was getting this money? Well, It was supposed to be for these little small businesses that couldn't afford to keep their employees on. But as they write here, billions of dollars went to companies owned by wealthy celebrities, including Tom Brady, Khloe Kardashian, she's really deserving, and many larger companies, manufacturing construction firms. And so there were people that applied for this that didn't need it. There were people that applied for this and didn't have the employees they said they had. There were people that applied for this and didn't keep their employees on as they were supposed to. And the government, expected that there would be some of that. And they had a mechanism to deal with that, these scam artists, and that was to deny forgiveness. In other words, you would have to pay the loan back if you were caught cheating. Well, regardless, the vast majority of loans have been forgiven. Okay. And it turns out that some assistant professor of finance at the University of Texas in Austin estimated that $64 billion of the $800 billion in loans were fraudulent. Fake payrolls, multiple businesses listed at the same home address, that type of thing. And that corresponds to about 70,000 loans that were fraudulent. And then there are people that's outright fraud, the employees didn't exist. Then there are people that took the money that didn't really need it, and then it was forgiven, so they just basically got a free handout from government. And now, you perhaps understand why we have inflation in the United States, because this was money that was just showered around. You may as well have taken a helicopter up and just shoveled buckets of $100 bills out the window, out the door, and people took that money and spent it. And of course, there was no corresponding production. So you have consumption without production. And what that leads to is inflation. So there you have our government at its best again, wasting our money. And, why do they do this? They do this because they want to be reelected. The people that were involved here, they are, well, I guess, Trump, Pence, I guess that is, I don't recognize all these stiffs there, Mnuchin. They were the people that brought this into effect. And then the Biden administration, that's why NPR is, by the way, that's why they're shining a light on this, because in their opinion, these are the bad guys. They don't care for Trump and his like. In fact, it was the Biden administration that executed and administered it. In a sentence, in a soundbite, this is what the program was: $800 billion. Here it is. Don't pay it back. That's what it was. Brilliant. Just a brilliant thing the government did there. So again, we have two examples here, and I could go on, of how government invariably messes up. So when we're coming back to this discussion about socialism, where government must now be in charge of our capital stock, all of our tools, all of our locomotives, all of our equipment, all of our factories, this is what the socialists aspire to, you're not going to get efficient and effective deployment of capital. You're going to get a lot of waste and corruption and fraud. And that's one of the reasons why, socialism inevitably collapses, as it has in Soviet Union, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Cuba, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's take a look at this chart here, which is I don't know who these people are trading economics. They're just the data service places on that provide economic data. And let's look at this measurement here, government spending to GDP by country. So this is the amount of GDP that government controls versus the private sector. In other words, it's a good measure of the degree of socialism in that country where government decides they know better and they're going to manage that sector of the economy or that aspect of the economy and their wisdom, and they're going to decide, make all the capital decisions. They're going to decide how the proceeds of that endeavor are then divided up among the citizenry. So lo and behold, surprise, surprise, the top of the list is France with 57% government influence in the economy. And over half the economy in France is run by the government. That's what this says. Wow. So you don't hear people talk about France very often as a socialist country, but there it is. It's the most socialist country in the world. Now, if you look behind those figures, what France does is they run a lot of, that high-speed train that they trumpet in France. Most of France's electricity comes from nuclear power stations that are paid for by the government. France has its fingers in the automobile industry. They have their fingers in the aerospace industry through their participation in Airbus, company called EDS, I think it's called. The French government is a direct shareholder in that company. So there they are, and they are, this goes back to the French Revolution, where it was all about the equality. What do they say? Liberté, égalité, fraternité, which roughly translates to freedom, equity, and unity. Now, where have we heard that? Seems I've heard that on TV recently. Liberty, freedom. A lot of talk about freedom, a lot of talk about equity, and then unity, which is brotherliness. In fact, I think it was our aspiring Vice President Walz who said socialism is just another word for neighborliness. So where their head is at and which side of the fence they come down on. Okay, then we look down the list here. Finland, not surprising. That's Scandinavia. Well, it's not strictly a Scandinavian country, but it's up there in that frozen northern part of Europe, highly socialist. Italy, surprising. Italy has a fairly robust private sector. They make cars, they make shoes, they make clothing, they, a lot of private sector activity. They make great cheese and pasta and what have you, but there's an awful lot of government influence in the Italian economy. And I guess if you live in Italy, you may or may not like that. I suppose if not too many people object because they've been voting for this system for decades. Belgium, I know well. I've lived there and worked there. It's quite socialist. Lots of government regulation. If you are in the private sector, if you're running a company, there are 10,000 rules and regulations, especially those protecting labor. Austria, Greece, we know Greece is socialist. That's why they went bankrupt. Europe as a whole is about 50-50. So Europe is right in the middle of that spectrum between socialism and capitalism. Cuba, there you go. They're still pushing this, and surprisingly, they're not even as they've fallen on their face. The average standard of living in Cuba is atrocious, even for highly skilled people. And they're still pushing this government good thing. There's the European Union, which is similar to the Euro area. Euro area just includes some countries that are outside the European Union. Okay, now we're getting into what we wanted to talk about, which is Scandinavia. Here's Sweden right at 50%. Here's Denmark at 46.8%. And here's Norway at 46.4%. So they're all right around 50-50 countries. There aren't too many countries in Europe that are much less socialist than those examples. Here's the United States at 34%. So, to say that the United States is a free market capitalist system is not true. government in all its forms runs a third of the economy. Um, and we all know what that is. You know, it's defense, it's entitlements, it's education, it's law and order, et cetera, et cetera. So we're already at a 35% level. Switzerland is less socialist than us. And let's see who is the least socialist country in the world. India, 15%. There you go. So India has a large poor class or subsistence level class, but they are not falling for the socialist stuff. Afghanistan, they're not falling for it either. Croatia, Ireland. It's no surprise that a lot of European companies and American companies that want to do business in Europe are headquartered in Ireland. There you go. Ireland, which, when I was a student, I visited Ireland, and the one thing that I remember clearly was staying in a youth hostel. And one of the other inhabitants of this youth hostel was a local Irish gal, and they were all, and a guy, and they were geared up to go the next day to get their dole money, which they have to go stand in line someplace to get their hand out. So I'm surprised that that's so low. But there you have it. Australia, that we've talked about, is more free market capitalist oriented than we in the United States are. Okay, so that's the map there. Now let's see. I said there's no such thing as free stuff. Okay, so this chart here, which is produced by the Tax Foundation, which I guess is a kind of a research organization that might be a bit conservative. But they looked at the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Countries, which are most of the developed countries in the world. And they try to figure out what percent of your earnings are commandeered by the government to pay for their socialist ideas and activities. And they looked at income taxes and payroll taxes, both those paid by the employee and those paid by the employer. So they ranked various countries to see, who pays for this stuff and how much. Okay, so we mentioned Belgium. There you go. Belgium, wonderful Belgium. Over half of your earnings get commandeered by the government to pay for all that government interference and good stuff. There's France, we talked about them, 46%. Italy, we talked about them. Finland, blah, blah, blah. The average in the OECD is about 1/3 of your money that they take. And this is for the average, working person. This is not for someone at the very high end or the low end. Colombia doesn't take any. Well, there you go. Maybe they can make a lot of money off drugs and they don't need it. Chile, 7%. Mexico, only 20%. There's Australia, we talked about 30%. The United States takes about the same, about 30%. But remember, there's another way the government gets money to pay for all this stuff, and that is by borrowing money and, pay later scheme. And the United States lets us off a little bit here, but then in the middle of the night, they go out and borrow a whole bunch of money to augment that. And that money is going to have to be paid back either by working people who are now young or by, children of people, the children that have not started working yet. So there you see evidence of what I said earlier. There is no free stuff. It's other people's stuff, and someone has to pay for it. In Belgium, everybody who's working pays through their nose, and I guess they like it. Or at least enough of them like it to keep the government on that path. It's very difficult once you start handing out quote unquote free stuff to stop doing it. You get voted out immediately because everyone who was taking free stuff gets mad and goes to the voting and votes you out. So once they start, it's hard to stop, even if a good percentage of the citizens do not like it. So the three countries we were going to talk about, Norway is right there, a bit above average, 36%. Sweden should be about there, 42%. They're, in the upper echelons, upper percentage. And Norway, Denmark was the other one. Denmark is right here by Norway, about 36%. Now, one thing you need to understand about these countries, Scandinavian countries that supposedly have found the sweet spot in socialism, and everybody that advocates socialism in the United States points to Scandinavia as the shining example and how wonderful it is. One of the things you want to know about those three countries is their location. Let's take a look at a map here. So this is the BBC. So there's Sweden, there's Denmark, and Norway's up here somewhere. They're in the North Sea. Now, if you know anything about the North Sea, there's a word missing here. It's oil, O-I-L, North Sea oil, and lots of it. So these three countries get a lot of money from oil. They let private companies go and drill the holes, take the risks, suck the oil up, market the oil, and then they just put their hand out and say, no, give us half of it, or whatever the percentage is. So one of the ways that these three countries can fund their free handouts are by taxing the oil revenues and not so much the workers, which we saw in the previous chart. Remember, these three countries didn't seem to be too extreme, not as extreme as Belgium in terms of how much of your money they commandeer every month. Now, here's a gentleman from the Heritage Foundation, which we know is a conservative organization, so you can discount that a bit, who says that socialism in Scandinavia is a myth. It's not really socialist. He says it's a chimera wrapped in an illusion inside a dream. Okay, well, in other words, it's BS. So the Scandinavians do have a little different culture. They want security, safety, and they don't want to take risks. So they tolerate some of this stuff. And the United States is a different country than Scandinavia. These are tiny countries, by the way. They're about 10 to 20 million people each. So they're very tiny countries, and they have all that gushing oil. So they've gotten money to throw around. I guess the surveys have shown that these three countries are, all three of these countries finished in the top 10 of the quote unquote happiest countries in the world. Well, it's pretty nice if you've got an oil gusher in your backyard and your government keeps giving you money, doesn't make you work too hard, and gives you free healthcare. Now, Bernie Sanders and AOC like to tout that happiest country fact. And at the same time, they don't point to China, Cuba, Venezuela. Then they look at Denmark, blah, blah, blah. They've got free education. By and large, these countries have pretty much free education, pretty much universal health care. And you pay a little bit for your health care, like co-pays and what have you, and you pay a little bit a month. But it's really just to stop you going to the doctor for nothing. It's not really any significant share of the cost. So these people are, they are Scandinavia files, if there is such a word. They love Scandinavia, and Norway's. Of course, Cortez doesn't realize that Finland's not in Scandinavia, but anyway, it's close enough, I suppose. So why is this guy saying that this doesn't exist? They have a strong capitalist free market element to their economies. And then they tax the hell out of the private sector, and they use that for these handouts. The Danish prime minister, when he visited the United States, this guy's name is Anders Fogh Rasmussen. He said, I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I'd like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Well, it's really a mixed economy is what it is. According to the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom, Denmark is the 10th freest country in the world, and the United States is 25th. So there you have it. these countries that AOC and them hold up as models are quite capitalist, although they do have, free healthcare and they do have free education. And you can read the rest of this yourself. Just point out again, there's no such thing as free stuff. And this is what it's like to live in Denmark and enjoy free healthcare and free education. There's a cost to that. Heavy taxes on all citizens, including the middle class, which bear a far greater burden than its counterpart in the United States. Low-income Danes pay an effective marginal tax rate of 56%. So even if you're not wealthy, you're just a working stiff, they're going to take half your money, and the middle class pays 57%. So everybody's paying through the nose. We don't have that in the United States. These people in the United States, these low-income people, pay virtually nothing in terms of federal taxes. And on top of that, when you get your 40, let's see, they leave you with 44 cents of every dollar you earn. You take that 44 cents to the store. Oops. Now they want another 25% on everything. Plus there's punitive taxes on coffee, beer, and chocolate. So you end up with maybe a quarter for every dollar you earn. That's in terms of real purchasing power. And yes, you get free healthcare, but you don't have any money left to buy anything else. That's what it's like living in this model. So there you go. You can read this article again. It's at the Heritage Foundation. Lee Edwards is the author, and he says it's a myth. Well, it's not a. He's being a purist here. It's not 100% socialist model like Cuba, Venezuela. It's kind of toward the middle there of the spectrum, and the United States is to the left of the middle, and France is to the right of the middle. And there's no pure capitalism. There's no pure socialism, as I mentioned. Let's now look at a little bit of detail here. Denmark, I mentioned. Denmark is in the North Sea. They get all this oil money from these oil companies that will take all the risk and pump this oil up, and they just take these socialist economies and governments in general. They are your best friend when you're making money. They're your partner in your business, boy. They're right there beside you. They want their share of the profits. They have their hand out. Where's mine? But if you lose money, you turn around, they're nowhere to be seen. They don't want to know you if you're losing money. There's no subsidy if you lose money. The tax thing works only one way. Well, in the United States, if you lose $2,000, you can write that off against your other income or your other profits. But $2,000 is a piddling amount in the scheme of things. If you lose, as I have in some investments, $100,000, then the other $98,000 comes straight out of your pocket, pal, and we don't want to know you. So there you go. I told you they're tiny. There's 5.9 million people in Denmark. That's probably about the population of New York City. They live to be 79 and 83. Well, that's fine. They have good health care. They're not very big in terms of land extent. They're probably about as big as New Jersey. And funnily enough, it's a frickin' monarchy. Here's the king and the queen, Queen Mary and King Frederick. I wonder how AOC, whether she just pays any attention to that aspect. Okay, so these people don't really have much say, but they have a king and a queen, and they have a prime minister, and here she is, Mette Frederiksen, she's called. She's a social democrat, and she is left of center, and she recently threw out the prior government, which was right of center, and they'd been running the show for 4 years. She campaigned on stronger welfare policies, but no, she wants to be tough on immigration. Now, this is an interesting aspect of these socialist countries. In countries where the government is handing out money left and right, obviously the immigrants are lining up at the border to get in because, you know, the idea of free stuff is pretty compelling. So you can't have too many people show up and, you know, it's going to collapse the system. As it is, people are barely left with any money at the end of the month to spend on stuff they want, as opposed to things that the government think they should have. So she's tough on immigration. AOC should read that paragraph as well. Okay, so here's some history of it in the 10th century, blah, 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 you know, the whole country. And you can look up these other countries in Norway, for example, on the BBC website here, BBC News, Norway country profile. There's Norway. They've heard of the fjords. Well, that's all these little inlets here where the ocean sort of backs up into these river valleys. And they have nice salmon fishing and spectacular mountains and so on. Well, Norway, they also have a royal family. Here they are, the royal stiffs with their little white gloves. Now, how's that going to go down in the United States? Here you could have Chelsea Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and I don't know who these two might be, Joe Biden and his wife. How would you like that? I think they would like it, but and they aspire to it, a sort of royal. They are a sort of royalty. But the king here, he's a keen sportsman. Oh yes, he's a yachtsman. He has a wonderful old time. He married a commoner. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. The prime minister, on the other hand, a mean-looking guy. He's center left. He doesn't have a majority, so he has to party up. He has to form a coalition with those dreaded right-wingers. But he's an out-and-out socialist. He wants more of this government stuff. Let's see how big this country really is. Here you go, 5.4 million, another New York City. They speak all these different languages. They live forever, and they live on a tiny little frozen patch of land up there in Northern Europe. So Sweden, here's Sweden. Sweden's probably the biggest of these three. Same story pretty much. Read about it and weep. They pay taxes through the nose. They have a problem. They don't have enough doctors. Well, who wants to be a doctor working for the government? Here we go. Primary health care in Sweden. Population of 9 million. They spend all of that money, and most of it on hospitals. They've had to have financial cutbacks. That always happens in these socialist models. They run out of money. As Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is pretty soon you run out of other people's money. There you have it. Number of hospital beds has diminished. Number of employees has diminished drastically. Hospitals have been restructured. Small hospitals can't do surgery. You have to go to a big city to get surgery. Blah, blah, blah. 5,000 GPs in Sweden, 80% are employed by the county councils. That would be like our counties. 20% are private. You can get stuff if you have the money. If you manage to somehow make some money in that country, and the government didn't confiscate, you can go to private health care if you're in a hurry, I guess. But they've got a problem in this country. They don't have enough physicians. They're trying to have one physician per 1,500 inhabitants. It's been a disappointment. The counties aren't hiring enough people. They don't have the money. The biggest problem is the shortage of specialists. So they're all getting old, these doctors. They're getting close to retirement, and there goes your free health care. You gotta love it. Okay, so one thing I didn't say about Denmark and some of these other countries as well is they've done something pretty interesting, and I'll come back to this in a future episode, is they've got all this oil money, and they realize that the money's not going to last forever. So they're salting it away in something called a sovereign wealth fund. All right. So um, if you look at the screen here, Norway has the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. In other words, a government pension fund, it's called the Government Pension Fund Global. This is real money that the government owns. That it's $1 trillion. That's a pretty healthy sum of money, just over $1 trillion. And they've managed to build that up since 1990. That's not that many years ago. It's in our lifetime. China has $1 billion. Abu Dhabi has about a half, $750 million. Kuwait has these oil companies. I don't know where China just gets theirs from slave labor. But these governments, unlike the United States that has a IOU in their Social Security fund, money that's already been spent. These countries have real investments in real companies around the world, and they're growing in size because they're investing in the private sector of the United States, for example. And that's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll come back to that in the future episode. So that's all I have to say on the subject of Scandinavia and socialism, capitalism, capital. Until next time, we'll come back to the United States and discuss some thoughts and ideas that I have as to how we can learn from some successes around the world and start digging ourselves out of this hole that we're busy digging at a frantic pace. So thank you once again for your time, and I hope you found this at least not too boring. Have a government-free day.